two modes. One is being at home and watching us remotely, but also that we do have the opportunity for folks to be able to come here in a safe manner. And so I'm grateful that as I go around to the churches in the Bay Area, that I'm seeing more and more of our folks are becoming more confident in being able to come back together. You know, as we have communion today, I don't know how you did it as far as, well, no, I do know how you did it, because I think I led a few of those remotely. It was always, oh, go to your refrigerator, get the closest thing that looks like bread, and get the closest thing that looks like grape juice. And as much as it is all symbolic, we know, of communion, there's nothing like actually being together. I mean, isn't that the whole point of communion, is an opportunity for fellowship? And so I'm glad that we do have these opportunities. My hope is that when we do have communion, I think you often have it on the first Sunday of the month. My hope is that if you can make it down here, I think it will bless you as much as you would also be a blessing to others that are here. Today I wanted to talk to you about a subject. It's part of the series that I've been doing in Luke, and it's in this patch of chapters which I've entitled the Destination series. You know, because it almost seems like we're not quite there yet, but God is calling us to do something, to be something. And so my hope is that's what you'll see in today's passage. Now, today's passage actually is nothing that is unfamiliar to you. Most of you know this story. I learned this story, I think it was either in 3rd or 4th grade in Sunday school. It's the story about the publican and the Pharisee. And before I read the passage here, what I wanted to also share with you is tomorrow, if you know, for those of you who aren't working, every retirement day is the same day, okay? But for those that are still working, you know that it is a holiday. So allow me to be able to share that Labor Day was actually established in the late 1800s. It was established by the President Grover Cleveland, but there were actually two guys that were very involved, and their names are really close. I think they actually have the same first name, and they were folks that were, you know, involved in like the labor movement as well as in Congress. And these two guys apparently got together, and from that they wanted a celebration that honored the American labor force, the American spirit of work. And so from that they instituted a law that, you know, the first, I think it actually did start out as the first Sunday of, the first Monday of September would be honored as Labor Day. It was it was passed by Congress, and they actually went into detail about that it shall have parades and a celebration with picnics. And so if you're not going to a parade or, you know, having a picnic, you can watch one at home, I suspect, as well as I was telling my wife, because we did have a barbecue yesterday. We have a picnic in our, you know, we have all these leftovers. We have a picnic in our refrigerator. So, you know, there are ways that you can continue to celebrate Labor Day. And again, so for those that are retired, every day may seem the same day, but, you know, in ways, this is kind of honoring you as well for your good work in your finished career. And so I hope you see it that, yes, it includes you as well as those of us who actually still get it as a holiday. Well, let me get into the passage, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. It starts in Luke chapter 18, verse 9 through 14. And let me go ahead and read. It says, "To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else." I want to stop there and just say, take note of that one phrase. Oh, and by the way, the thing that I forgot to mention is you see this little diagram there, or this little graphic that's here on the side with a little dinosaur inside. That is actually what's called a QR code. So if you didn't pick up notes, I do have the hard copy of the notes in the back if you're the kind that likes to fill in the blank. Okay, but if you're not the kind that likes to fill in the blank and you do have a smartphone on you, if you hold your phone with the camera up to this little guy, which I actually show on every slide, it will download the notes with everything filled in for you. Okay, so that you can have that for your reference. And so as we get into this, like I said, I want you to note that first phrase and just kind of put a bookmark there, and we'll come back to it later. As we continue, it says, Jesus told this parable. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector, or in some translations they call it a publican. The Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself, God, I thank you that I am not like the other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I give 1/10 of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, this is the big reveal that Jesus gives to his disciples. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Again, it's a story you probably know all too well. And often, at least when I learned it, it was a story about how we should pray. And I'm not saying that it's not about that, but I think there's more that we can dig into, and I hope that you'll be able to see that today. So more that we can dig into that really is a number of different lessons for us that distinctly apply to what we are going through in today's day and age. But I'd like to detour over to a commentary that I often use for a lot of my messages, and I'm going to go ahead and just read it. It's a commentary specifically for this passage, and I thought it would be revealing for you. It says, many modern Christians have heard this parable so often that they immediately associate Pharisees with self-righteous hypocrisy and tax collectors with humble piety. In Jesus' day, the Jews viewed them differently. It was the Pharisees who were the models of righteous behavior, and the tax collectors who epitomized sinfulness. Therefore, this parable undoubtedly made a great impact on the disciples. You could almost imagine that if this type of parable were given today, the people that we most respect are all of a sudden the bad people in the story, okay? And the people that we would epitomize as those that are the bad people in our society today, those turn out to be the good people. So you could already imagine that the disciples' reaction, if this were fast forwarded into our context today, is they're like, what? What's this all about? You know, because we know of Pharisees as the righteous people. And now you're saying, what? They're not? And we know of these tax collectors as the unrighteous people. And what? Now you're saying they are? You know, and so this was earth-shattering for disciples, but it also broke the mode of what they knew of people. And I found that is interesting in itself. But before I even get any deeper than that, let me just share with you a couple of observations that I see from this passage. The first one, if you haven't noticed, it's about two people. Okay, Jesus tells this story, and the story is specifically the two subjects of the story are a Pharisee and a publican, or tax collector, as some translations have it. The next thing that we see, it is clear they are doing the same thing in terms of their action. They are both praying in the temple. Nothing earth-shattering about that, but this is what we see, and I hope that this is probably the lesson you never got in Sunday school. And that is, when we look at the Pharisees' prayer, as much as we look at it as just being self-righteous and pious, there are actually some elements that are diametrically opposed to what the publican was going through. In that, in the Pharisees' prayer, it was more outward. Okay, it was showy. It was trying to demonstrate. It was basically a message, right? You know, he's saying these things so that other people can hear it. But not only that, he's basically calling out the people that are all around him. So it was meant to be outward. That was the way that he frames this prayer. And not only that, by being outward, we're seeing that it's critical of others. So it's more than just a self-righteous prayer. There is a method behind his prayer. And I think it's interesting, if that's the method that was behind his prayer, you look at what the publican's prayer was like then. And as you look at the publican's prayer, it was actually the exact opposite. Rather than being outward, talking about society that's all around us, he chose to focus his prayer inward, to talk about, or to share what was going on with him inside. And so it wasn't so much critical of others, it was critical of self. And I hope those are just some of the elements that we see. Well, it's not just a prayer of, this person was being self-righteous and this person was being humble, but that there were some actual directions that go on in terms of the method in which they prayed. One was very outward, and it really is a lesson to us, is how many times do we actually pray inwardly? Do we actually look at, are we critical of ourselves before we're critical of others? And so my hope is that that's the first lesson that we see. Just by looking at how they prayed and seeing how opposite they were, we can see some lessons for ourselves. The next thing that I want you to notice is this, is that the story addresses certain people who were convinced of their own righteousness and despised others. Where did I get that from? Noticed in that first verse, remember I told you to bookmark that one phrase. It said, to some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else. Okay, you can almost imagine what Jesus was doing. It's like he was looking at these people and he was seeing a certain type of behavior that was going on. And he said to himself, let me tell a story that might be able to indirectly address that. We see that in the Bible over and over again, right? For those of you who know the story of King David, right? I believe it was Nathan that tells him this story, and King David's like, what? Who would do that? And he goes, you're the guy. And so we see the method of trying to teach truth throughout the Bible is that way. They often use a story. I have a 4-year-old grandson. And, I know, for those of you who have kids, you always hear the term terrible twos, okay? I think there's actually something that should be called terrible fours. Because when they're 4 years old, it's not just them running around. They have a mind. It's starting to develop. So they can be very willful. For those who remember the old James Dobson parenting, the strong-willed child, they can be very willful in the things that they do. There is truly intention. It's not they're just running around. They're starting to develop that. And so when they get angry, then what happens is they don't know how to deal with it. And I was watching this in my grandson, because we take care of him, a couple of days a week. And I thought, like Jesus, maybe I can tell him a story. So I go to Amazon Kindle and I find a book called Today I Am Mad. Okay, it was a kid's book. And so I was like, let me share with you this book. Right? And by sharing you with this book, my hope is that you also reveal within yourself that that's me in this story. That, when I'm mad, I need to learn to figure out a way to deal with my anger by throwing fireballs, by counting to 4, by doing these things. And, the little do I realize he's still 4 years old. And I wonder if it's the same thing with Jesus, is he's trying to think of, I see this behavior in these people. Allow me to tell a story. But I wonder if the people actually get it or not. Or they think, oh, that's a good story. And I wonder if we do the same thing ourselves. Is that as we look at passages like this and we say, oh, that's a good story. If it's actually, we should be responding by saying, oh, that's a story about me. And I think that's the next lesson that we learn about this. Is that Jesus, he already has scoped out what these people are like. And so he says, okay, let me tell a story that addresses this behavior. And I wonder if we don't look at enough at Jesus' stories to figure out, maybe that's my behavior as well. So as you see in the question to ponder, well, maybe I'm not so good and maybe they're not so bad, is the lesson that we should learn. I've been watching, and this is for those of you, because I know a lot of you don't necessarily watch a lot of the shows that are going on today. But you have people that you engage with, whether they're younger friends that are in the next generation below you, whether they're your kids or your kids' kids. So I try to keep up with what are some of the developments, and I have to do it because it's kind of part of my work as well. Trying to understand what is emerging in society today. And one of the things that I've been watching, because I've been a big Marvel fan. Actually, I'm a big Marvel DC Comics fan, ever since I was a little kid. I love Batman and Superman. My favorite is Captain America. So I like watching the old, and of course we all say the same thing, right? If we would have only kept the comics that we had back then, we would be rich now. Okay, so let me assure you, if you own a house in this area, you're already rich. Okay, so you don't have to worry about that. But as I've started watching these shows, because they keep coming out with new ones, and they mirror the comics that are in Marvel. There's one a series you might have heard of it. It's called Loki. Okay, and Loki is, for those of you who heard of Thor, okay, is that Loki is Thor's brother. And they call him the god of mischief. Okay, so often, at least when I was growing up, you thought of Loki as just this evil guy. But the interesting thought about this series, and like I said, if you want to be able to talk intelligently to some of our younger generation, the interesting thought about this series is they portray Loki as not a bad guy. He's kind of a good guy, but not really a good guy. And probably the most profound quote that is said through the entire Loki series, movie series, or the series that they have on Disney Plus, is this. And I picked up on it. It said, Loki says, that bad people are not truly bad, and good people are not truly good. And I thought about that. And that's like, that actually almost mirrors, if you look it up yourself, Mark chapter 10. Verse 18. Remember when they were saying to Jesus, "Good teacher," and he said, "Why do you call me good? There is no one good except for God." Remember, and so you almost start to wonder, this is emerging as a topic, even though we didn't bring it up in the Bible anymore. Who really is good, and who really is bad? And I wonder if that's also what Jesus is challenging in this story. Because the people at that time thought Pharisees were all good. And they thought publicans were all bad. And so it almost challenges that thought. Who really is good and who really is bad? And we can see that not only in Mark chapter 18, verse 10, but as we look at the passages in Romans, right? 3:10, 3:23, right? It challenges the fact that the people we think are good are not so good after all. People think that are bad can be redeemable. And so I think that's an interesting point, because often we probably think that we're better than we are. And so maybe we need to ask ourselves, maybe I'm not so good. Maybe they're not so bad. The other example then, the example that we then see of these Pharisees is viewed by us as ridiculous and self-revealing. It's one of those things that we look at the passage today, unlike the people back during that time. We're saying, yeah, obviously, that guy was, that Pharisee was full of himself, right? And we look at, we think of the humility of the publican, and we're saying, this story is ridiculous. It wasn't ridiculous at that time. It seems ridiculous to us now. However, how many of us have actually looked and said to ourselves, well, are we ridiculous? Is that what this passage is also saying? Is it actually self-revealing, not for the Pharisee, but self-revealing for us? So here's a couple of things that I want us to kind of take note of. Is that as we look at this publican, this tax collector, I think it actually models what the real us should be. If there's one criticism that often is given of Christ's followers, it's what? We're hypocrites, right? We act this way, we talk this way, but we act another way. Okay, we don't live up to who we are, and often it's because they view us, they view Christ's followers as being fake, not real. And so how can we be more real? And I think the tax collector in his example actually has some lessons for us. I think the first thing that we see in this tax collector and how he models it for us is that notice what he did. In that passage, if you look at it again, it says that he distances himself from those who are called righteous. I think we're so used, if you were to look at like who your friends are, who the people you associate with, I think you would say they're pretty much like you. Right? They're pretty much people that are quote unquote good people. And I wonder, have we ever thought of, just doing a scan around the people that we associate with and how many times we actually associate with unrighteous people? I remember talking to someone and asking that kind of question, because I have a situation where I work with all kinds of different people. And I remember sharing with him, that, I work with a certain, I don't want to necessarily reveal because I don't want to be distracting the message. Like, he worked with a certain type of people, and he says, oh, I've never worked with anyone like that before. And I was thinking, how that's probably indicative of many Christians, is that we only stick to the people we know and like and are just like us. But what did the publican do here? It says he distanced himself from those who were calling themselves righteous. I don't know how you do that in your life individually, but I think we all need to search for a way that maybe we can find our ways to distance ourselves from those who might be called righteous. The second thing I see is this. Is notice how, and we talked about the publican prays inwardly. It's just he focuses on his flaws and failures rather than his successes and accomplishments. It's an inward prayer that he gives. And in that prayer, he talks about the things that he's messed up on. And I wonder if we, within our prayer, as much as we pray for everything and everyone, is there ever a point where we pause and just give an introspective look at what might be the mess-ups that we had this week or that we've had, for the last month? And I think that's where, and often, what do? When we focus on those flaws and failures, it's not in our prayer. We're often thinking of them in our idle time, or somehow it distracts our work. But there's two things that we're seeing that's being said here. Is that rather than using all this other time to focus on our flaws and failures, how I messed up on this, is that we bring it to the Lord and focus on it within our prayers. The third thing that I see is this, is that what the publican, what the tax collector was actually doing, wasn't so much false humility. He wasn't trying to portray himself, and this is the point that we need to be careful about. He wasn't trying to portray himself as being worse than he was. He wasn't showing false humility. He was being very honest about what he messed up on and what his flaws and failures were. He wasn't trying to say, I'm just the most miserable person in the world. Right? He was really trying to give an earnest petition that God would lift him up in his most vulnerable areas. And I know it's hard because we know just the story. But if you start thinking more deeply into what he was actually doing, I think what you'll find is these are the observations that we see, and these are the lessons that we can learn to be real with the folks that are around us. So I wonder if this is it. The summary of this lesson is really being real avoids portraying ourselves to the outside world as better than we truly are. I wonder if that's actually what we need to be more concerned about. How do we show up as being real? I think I told you this story before, but if you forgot it, let me tell it again. Is that I remember one time we played this game at work, and this is a global group. So they're from all over the world. They're from the UK, they're from Switzerland, they're from Canada, they're from Latin America. I mean, and they're from Asia. Okay, so these are folks that are from all over the world. And I remember we played this game called Fruit Basket. Okay, for those of you who don't know what Fruit Basket is, you didn't play it in middle school. What happens is you have this circle with all these chairs, but there's one chair missing. Okay? And so what happens is somebody calls out an attribute that you identify with. At least this is how it was played in this context. Okay? And if you identify with that, you get up and you go and you try to find another chair. Now ultimately somebody's going to miss out, and that person will not have a chair, and he calls out the next attribute, right? And so at that point, then what happens? He calls something out, and everybody gets up again, and they'll kind of jumble around until somebody doesn't have a chair again. I had that happen to me, and so I was the guy that didn't have the chair, and I was thinking, what am I going to call out? What am I going to call out? You know, as the attribute or the character that people kind of identify. And so I called out the phrase "being real," okay, and when I did. You know, because up to this point, people were you know, getting up a little bit because nobody wanted to lose their seat, right? You know, so but when I said being real, everybody got up and moved around. And I got a seat, okay. And so when I did that, it just reminded me that this is a world problem. That often we're struggling to try to find a way to be more real. You know, and especially in this next generation, is that as we work, as we communicate, as we engage the generations below us, they're looking for us to be more real. A guy named Jordan Peterson, he's like a psychologist that's in Canada. He writes a lot of stuff about lessons of life. And one of the things that he was sharing is, you know when you're not being real anymore is when the phrases that you're saying aren't your own. There's something that you read in a book, or you heard your friends say, or something you saw on TV. When you stop using words and sentences and dialogue that it's not coming from you. It's coming because it's something you saw, and you're just repeating what somebody else said. Because when you start getting into that type of habit, you become less real. And so my hope is that, and often in church, we don't talk about, what's the doctrine of real, right? It's not a lesson that we often give. But here, I hope you see within the story, it's embedded that we need to have this longing to be a more authentic self than we are. And not only is it just the Christian world that's seeing this, it's, as I saw, in a global context as well, people are longing to be more real. And what we're seeing also in the workplace, which is actually changing, is that real means different things for people. And people are trying to be more what they call, what they're trying to show up as their authentic self. Because when people do that, the best ideas come forward. But how do we show up as fake? Okay, and our society gives us that opportunity to show up as fake. If you follow somebody on Twitter or on Instagram or on Facebook, my guess, in most cases, all you're seeing is the good part about them. Nobody takes a picture of their burnt cake or their terrible dinner or the lousy vacation that they went to. Right? They're taking pictures of all the good stuff that happens in their life. And so often we get in this habit of thinking, oh, these people live such a pristine, perfect world. And they talk about how blessed they are. Happens to Christians as well, right? It's that often we talk about all these great things that happen to us. And social media has allowed us to be less real. It's what we're seeing in our lives. If we were only able to show what the true self, what the true us it really is, I think you'll see a different type of Instagram or Twitter or Facebook or any of these kinds of things that we see in our lives. But how should we display our authentic self? I found this article that really talked about this because, like I said, this is a topic that you're going to see not just in churches, but outside of church more and more. It's like, how do we show up as our authentic self? A lot of it's happening because of a lot of the racial injustices that you're seeing now highlighted in public. Not only in terms of Black Lives Matter, but you're seeing it with AAPI, as Asian American Pacific Islander hate, right? And violence. All these things are starting to highlight what minorities go through Okay, and so how do people show up as their authentic self? It's being highlighted more and more that we see in our context in society today. And so I found this article about in Scientific American, and it kind of speaks to what is the what unfortunately is the hurdle that we have to get over to show our authentic self. Okay, and it talks about the inconvenient truth about your authentic self. If I can read the subtitle, it says, to actually feel authentic, you might have to betray your true nature. Okay, and what did he mean by that? And so there was actually a segment in here that I want to be able to share with you. So allow me just to read it. So when it comes time to actually make a judgment about your own authenticity, so if we're looking at someone saying, you know, you're real, you know, the way you said that, all that came out real. Okay, what does real actually mean? Okay, a judgment about our own authenticity, we may use criteria that are closer to how we judge the authenticity of an object, such as food. A passion fruit tiramisu may be unique, but the authenticity of tiramisu is judged by its conformity to a conventional recipe. That means, for those of you who ever had tiramisu, it's basically a dessert. Started in Italy. I think it's Veneto, Italy. Okay, I'm sorry, Veneto, Italy, back in the 60s and 70s. Usually you have it when you're at either some fancier type of restaurant. Okay, and for those of you who've had it, you're probably tasting it now. Okay, and so you know what it tastes like. Okay, but one of the things that I think is interesting and what is trying to be brought out is this lesson in here is that often we say, oh, that's a real tiramisu, right? You know, is what we see. But what we're associating it with, we're associating it with what we think of or what is the common recipe of tiramisu. So it's not based on authentic, meaning it tastes like the one back in the 60s and 70s in Veneto, Italy. We're saying it's authentic because it tastes like what we know of as the common recipe. And I wonder if that same thing is happening. So we may talk about being real at work, and all that means is being what people think we should be. It's not really real. And so that's really what is trying to be brought out in this article, because now we're seeing people as and society and our industry inviting people to be your real self. In other words, you have the opportunity to be able to say, you know, this is who I really am. I think you recognize this very well for those of you that are around my age growing up, in that most of the schools I went to, I was the minority as a Chinese. Okay, and I remember my mom used to make us, like, and during Chinese New Year's, bring a bag of stuff, okay, to give to the teacher. And I remember I hated that because I know it was all foreign stuff for her, and it was like those coconut strips, you know, the shrimp chips, you know, some candies that you can't buy at Safeways. You know, it's all this kind of stuff that you bring. It's like my mom said to bring this to you because it's Chinese New Year's. You know, and then what's more is it's like, oh, now she's going to humiliate me because, like, look at what David brought. Now let's talk about all these things, these wonderful things. What is this anyway? And you're like, you know, I don't know. And so you choose to not be yourself because those are the things you eat at home, but here in class, it's embarrassing, right? So what do? We show up as someone different in the classroom. I remember a time when, you know, and this is probably the story that's told over and over and over again, right, by most Asian Americans, is, right, mom gives you something that's more, or Asians give you some, you know, Asian parents give you something that's more Asian, like, you know, a char siu bao or something like that to bring to lunch, right? And you're like, oh, I wish I had a sandwich, you know, so I could be like all the other kids, because that's what a real American is all about, you know, and now we're seeing all that is being broken down. That's not what a real American is all about anymore. People are showing up as more themselves. They want to know about other people's culture. You know, it even has gotten me, though I never got, you know, I saw this in a TED Talk, and it got me considering, it's saying, you know, this guy had decided that I'm not going to be called by my American name anymore. I'm going to change my name to I'm going to have people call me by my Chinese name. And I'm not going to no longer wear short hair anymore. I'm going to wear, you know, the Q like they did back, you know, back a long time ago in 1860s, right? You know, so they started re-engaging their Chinese culture. There are some folks that are doing that now. I know of a lady who you know used to be called Julia, and because she grew up in, you know, in a Russian background, she decided to show up as her authentic self. She's going to call herself Yulia, because that's actually how it's spelled and how it's pronounced in her family. And I wonder how much we have that opportunity now to show up as our real self, not just as Asians, but as Christ followers as well. We don't have to hide it anymore. You know, and I think that's what our real self is all about, because for years, that's what we did as Asians. But I hope you have some sympathy for the other minorities in America as well. If you never heard of a phrase called racial passing, I was surprised here. I didn't know such a thing existed. But you know, there was a time in our country where if you were a person that was black, but you had light skin, you tried to pass as a white person. Okay, and so there were, you know, this was apparently a common practice that people had for many years. They even wrote a movie back in the 30s called Imitation of Life, and it was about this woman who was black who portrays herself as a white person, and that happened a lot. Why? Because that's what America was all about during that time. That wasn't, you're not a real American unless you're white at that time. And so now we're seeing emerging a lot of people showing up as themselves because of their ethnicity, because of their faith. And so my hope is that we see this as a good thing, that we're able to now, perhaps in a safe way, little baby steps, be able to share with others and share with the world who we are, both as Asians, but also as Christ followers. Our authentic self, I have written down here, our authentic self may actually be based on how society views us. But my hope is that as we emerge, it's less about society and truly what we are inside. So how can we be real? I think there's a couple things. And that is this, actually three, I'm sorry. First is that we reflect on how others view you through their words and actions. This past week, I helped produce like a video for work, you know, where I'm demonstrating the latest system that we have. And I found it interesting because I'm like, it's not very good. And for those of you ever like done videos or things where you're taping yourself, you watch yourself and it's like, oh, that's not very good. You know, and I thought it was interesting. So I did this thing because they asked me to. And afterwards, you know, they sent it all around to all these people. And they're like, this is great. And I was thinking, what's so great about it? They said, because it's the you that I know. It's what they were saying. And I found that interesting because I still am trying to figure out the you that they know. You know, and so, you know, and then my son-in-law had come up with this personality kind of test. It's called an Enneagram. It's one that they use a lot in work. And it was interesting because in a lot of those things, I actually take them, you know, I take them pretty seriously because, you know, I want to get better. Right? You know, that's the way I see it. And so, you know, a lot of times we don't reflect on who we are or how other people look at us. And my hope is that if we want to be more real, we reflect on what are some of the things that people actually view us. And when they call us real, the real you, what does that actually mean? The second thing then is it's not just about viewing others. Let me see. But also I mean, viewing ourselves, it's also about viewing others. We reflect on the thoughts regarding your perception of others. You know, when you start looking at other people and saying, oh, they're so critical, or they're so negative, or they're so this, and you start to say, is that me as well? Am I also being negative and critical in saying that they're negative and critical? So I wonder if we, in order to be able to uncover the real self, we see how do we view others as well. And then finally, I think it's this. I think it's also, while we take those things about being real, is that we should observe how we pray before God. And I mean it this way. Is that, do we pray like Instagram? Do we just show God the good stuff? Okay, and from there, that's the extent of our prayer. Or do we actually pray like, and this is going to be a term that I'm going to have to explain. Do we pray like the dark web? Okay, and for those of you who don't know what the dark web is, dark web is actually a hidden section within the internet where all these things, these criminal activities are going on, where there's drug smuggling, where there's, you know, sex trafficking, where there's weapons and guns and things like that being exchanged, all in the secrecy of a spot within the internet. And I wonder if that's what we need to be uncovering to God. Is that rather than leaving these things as hidden things, the flaws and failures that we have in our lives, is that we need to be exposing them. Just like the dark web should be exposed so that they come into the light. So my hope is that as we think about, really, this is still, as you can see, it's in the context of our actions, but it does come back to the context of our prayer. As we start to enter into the Lord's Supper, communion today, my hope is I'm going to give you a chance to kind of search yourself. And really, it's my hope that you'll use this as a time of reflection, that God would help uncover what is the real you that needs to be shown out in public to the rest of the world. Let's close in a word of prayer. Our God, we thank you for this time that we can study your word. We thank you that often we see a story that was intended for a certain kind of people. And we just see the story, but we don't really examine that this story is about this certain kind of people, and maybe that certain kind of people is also us. And so, God, I pray that as we look at stories like this, that we're able to uncover and to be able and be transparent with ourselves to say, maybe that's me. God, search my heart so that I'll be able to know what might be the things I need to uncover, to bring out to the light, to bring before you, so that I can actually conform to the original recipe that you had for me. So God, I pray that our folks would be able to take this to heart, to be able to challenge themselves and to be able to reveal themselves to others as the real self. We ask in Jesus' name, amen.